Do we need more visible AI? Do we need AI to become more visible? What does that mean for users? What does that mean for companies? And what does that mean for society as a whole? So I've got a brilliant panel this evening to talk about this and explore this topic. First of all, let me introduce you to Tessa. Tessa works at Elsevier. She's a responsible AI and data science strategy manager. She specializes in ethical development of algorithmic and data-intensive systems, considering dimensions such as fairness, accountability, transparency, and explainability. That's not easy all to say. I'm impressed.
I'm impressed.
I'm impressed. You're a qualified IEEE certified AI ethics assessor and the vice chair of the IEEE AI Impact Use Case Initiative. And your background is in philosophy, researching explainability, interpretability, and trust. I mean, like all the difficult words, it's just like this is the topic. Thanks for joining, Tessa. Next to you, we have Sarah with us. Sarah is a doctoral researcher at the University College of London. She's in her final year of the PhD researcher, and she uses psychology, AI, and digital technology to help people detect online deception, such as phishing and fake news. She's published in a top-tier security and privacy conference and previously worked as a data scientist and AI consultant in the Netherlands. Thanks for joining, Sarah.
Thanks for having me.
Next to you, we have Walter. Walter is an AI and data policy advisor. He's a globally recognized advisor and speaker working at the intersection of AI, data, and public good. He advises some of the largest tech companies worldwide, as well as global central governments on designing policies to unlock the transformative. I'm reading like all this text now, and you can like notice it. The transformative potential of emerging technologies. Winner of the Prospect Public Policy Award by the University of Cambridge and AI Policy Fellow at the University of Bath. And last but not least, we have Kieron, who's joining us. Kieron has worked in technical privacy for the last 5 years, with more than 2 of those years spent at the intersection of privacy, trust and safety at Meta on the integrity team. He now runs his own consultancy, Privacy Execution, focused on technical implementation of governance and as part of CheckStep, an AI content moderation platform. Thanks all for joining. Cool. Just like, taking a bit of breather. I just want to start with maybe framing a bit more the conversation. Anyone wants to start on what do we mean by AI visibility? Maybe Tessa, do you want to make a start?
That's because I'm holding the mic. What do we mean by AI visibility? I think, so in terms of the work that I do, it's very related to fields like transparency and explanation. So if you're someone who knows nothing about AI, you know nothing about these systems, but you're using a social media platform or an email account, what can we do to facilitate you understanding what's happening in the background? And it's not necessarily about showcasing every aspect of what we do. You know, we don't necessarily want graphical neural nets being explained through Gmail, but it's about understanding where we should be showcasing, where we can be showcasing, and what people want and need to understand.
Thank you. Anyone else? Walter, do you have some examples?
Give it a shot, yeah.
Would you maybe just to frame things a little bit better as well for us, any examples of visible AI and maybe some examples of non-visible AI?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really a great question. I think when we talk about AI visibility, there's really a couple of terms that kind of overlap with the general concept. We can talk about AI visibility. Is it the same as transparency? Is it the same as putting tools in an open source format? In my view, it is not. In my view, AI visibility is really something that focuses really more on sort of really, let's call it the scratching the surface, potentially having some kind of opportunities and about the algorithms that we use in order to determine the products and services that we use. Now, when it comes to some services and products that are visible and some that are non-visible, there are really probably a couple of examples that can be differentiated based on, say, priority, maybe even high stakes. We can look at the public sector, and there are, for example, some AI tools that are put on, say, algorithmic registries, as some cities are doing right now, for example, on AI tools that are being implemented to make crucial decisions about your lives, such as, for example, social services that you might receive, but also some less crucial decisions, such as predicting traffic congestions in an urban center. There are also some tools that maybe are not visible at the moment, such as, for example, algorithms that are implemented by companies, algorithms that, for example, due to IP rights are still held close. And then there's probably a third category, which is like AI, like tools that are not visible, but potentially should be. And that's maybe some that, as I touched upon earlier, some of the public services, maybe within some countries that have policies that do not require either companies or some local authorities, and so on and so forth, to put these tools potentially more in a way that can be scrutinized by the public and civil society organizations. Thank you.
Thanks. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think in line with what Walter was saying, I think from a user perspective, because I come from a human-computer interaction background, it matters to whom the AI is visible. I think as like developers, we know what we're doing. Regulators might know on the surface or conceptually what might be going on with these neural networks or other AI that's getting developed. But as a user, I think people don't really care that much about the technicalities of it. But I do think it's really important that people know or are aware that AI is actually at play. Do you want to?
Yeah, so this might all sound very hypothetical, right? AI transparency, AI explainability, does it really impact me? There's legislation coming that's going to make tech companies explain and be transparent about how their algorithms work. So this is no longer a hypothetical ethical conversation. This is real world. And I feel very sorry for the guy who has to explain how the Facebook news ranking algorithm works, because I yet to meet anyone who can tell me the basics of that.
Yeah, I mean, like, just to bounce on what Sarah was saying, like, there are like a lot of legislation in place. I'm thinking GDPR, and we are all accepting all those cookies on the website, but we're not reading things anymore. There's like all these big terms of agreements. Aren't we like just going to add to it? What do we do about that?
Well, I'm glad you brought up the cookies on the banners, the cookie banners. They drive me nuts. I'm a privacy guy. They don't work, not in the way that the law intended anyway. The interesting thing is the Information Commissioner's offices, the UK regulator for privacy, did a survey of users. I can't remember the exact stats, but something like 80% of the general public were okay with behavioural advertising and accepted cookies when they were just asked. When someone actually sat down and explained to them how behavioural advertising worked, what signals are being processed, what data about them is being captured and used and sold, overwhelmingly people said, hey, I'm not okay with this. So there is some value. And I think people don't care is a common argument. People don't care because they don't understand. I think once people understand, they do start to care. And that's the bridge that especially EU lawmakers are now trying to cross with their cornerstone of fairness and transparency, which started with GDPR, which is now going to roll through with the Digital Services Act, which is coming into force early next year for some companies and early in 2024 for others. And then the AI Act as well, which is forcing companies to say, this is how our algorithms work, this is how they're free of bias, opening that up to independent audits.
Can I respond to that?
I've stolen the mic. I just wanted to add to that, you know, even if you're sitting there going, yeah, but I don't care, and I know that my mum doesn't care and my grandma doesn't care, it doesn't excuse not doing the right thing. We absolutely need to be in this space. It's not just because the legislators are coming or because the fines are going to be massive, which they will be. This is really about doing the right thing for society and supporting understanding of tools that are going to be critical in the lives of our children as they grow up and of our families. So I think it's just that bigger societal picture is really important.
Oh, we have two mics now.
We can argue.
Yeah. So on the topic of do users actually care about privacy, for instance, and how their data is used, there's actually a big literature out there that says that there's a privacy paradox in this case. So people may actually say they do care about data privacy and how new tracking technologies, for instance, use those data. But at the end of the day, people do just want to achieve what they want to achieve. And when you look at what they actually do, it's kind of the contrary of what they're saying. So I might say I care about privacy, but I still post a lot of things on social media. So I think it's a matter of finding the right alternatives so that people can, in a more privacy concerning way, still use those kind of functionalities that people obviously value. I value sharing things with my family on social media, for instance.
That's a great argument. Nobody's going to pay £10 a month to use Google.
Maybe they should.
Cool. So this is an interesting topic. I think if we direct things a little bit beyond, is transparency enough? How do we enable people? So we talk about this legislation coming in. How do they make things more visible, but is visible as transparency, is it enough? How can people feel a bit more active when they use the systems? Can we enable this?
Absolutely. No is the short answer to that question. Making something transparent is often required by the law. It's often the bare minimum that you can do. But just showing someone how something works doesn't help them understand, doesn't take them on that journey towards knowing what it means for them. So in all our work, we absolutely want to make sure that you're going beyond transparency and taking what Sarah said, it matters who it's transparent to and what they need to understand from it. Do they need to understand the technical detail? Do they need to understand what it means for sharing? Or it really matters. The context is critical. Oh, this one that way, that one that way.
I think the fairness and transparency thing is a time and place. I can't ever imagine a world where any time that you interacted with any type of AI, there's a pop-up box like a cookie banner that says, this is the data we use, this is the way this is processed. I think when AI goes wrong and when it impacts people negatively, it's that right to redress, that right to correct, that right to understand why this has gone wrong. But ultimately, as tech people, we need that feedback anyway. We spend millions, if not billions of dollars training models when there are users out there that can say, well, actually, these data points are actually where you got me wrong. That's valuable, and it works for everyone.
Yeah, and just to bounce on this, for companies, what does that mean? You mentioned when AI go wrong, first of all, what do companies have to do to make sure that they know when something goes wrong? Because it's not as if something is not working. So what are the implications for companies for that AI visibility?
Well, that's a great question. I think many times we don't really know when things go wrong. So one of the key points that when I speak to some clients is that it's kind of easy to, AI, something went wrong, and we think about sort of the flash crash of the stock market or some horrible thing that made the headlines. But I don't think it's necessarily that the things that make companies lose millions over the years. I think it's much smaller things. It could be operational inefficiencies. It could be the way that some data about users is handled, and then they find themselves the European Commission in front of their door who just slams a fine on them, and they're like, oh, we had no idea about what was going on. But looking at some of the data that we have at this point in time, and looking at sort of some of the dynamics that sort of develop when executives respond to sort of some of these things going wrong with AI, I observed that there's always some kind of hiatus, some kind of discrepancy between leadership teams and, on the other hand, the technical teams. And you might have an executive that has a very good understanding and overview of the business, but she or he might not necessarily know anything about the technology. And then on the other hand, you have some data scientists who are very, very focused on the job that they're doing, and they try to maximize everything in any possible way. But then when it comes to sort of the general policy and business picture, there is a clear discrepancy there. Making sure that sort of this bridge is built between those teams, I think is one of the key issues that sounds kind of obvious, but is one that is really still in really rudimentary development in the majority of companies globally at the moment.
Okay. If you want to, I mean, it's fine. Where was I? Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. The thing is that as a company, for a company, are there any dangers like making things visible? Any caveats? Anything that we want to prevent from like AI system to be completely transparent, for instance?
I'm happy to go on, or you can. Whoever.
Kieron, come on.
Yeah, you go first. You go first. I'll go after you.
Bumble guys. The trust and safety, the algorithms that detect bad behavior. So at Meta, one of the teams I worked closely with was the child safety teams. Catching groomers, we call it IIC, inappropriate interactions with children. And it stops adults from finding children to groom, essentially. Do we really want to tell those bad actors how we caught them doing what they were doing? We commission research. There are already forums out there where these guys sit around and talk about how they evade capture. So there's got to be that balance between those competing equities, between protecting people, but also being transparent about what's going on. But where do we draw the line? So pedophiles, terrorists, no safe spaces. We shouldn't tell them anything. But people that have inadvertently shared porn on Facebook, maybe we should tell them about how the algorithm works. But how do we do that in a sensible way? And I'm hoping you've got some ideas.
Thank you. Well, should we increase AI visibility across the board? I think it depends again on who you ask, right? I think the kind of like intuitive answers, if you're someone who works publicly a lot and sort of does a lot of public-facing work, or maybe works with government, is like, well, yes, absolutely. Because quite naively, maybe I'm like, oh yeah, I want to increase basically public visibility. I want to increase accountability. I want to ensure that whatever algorithms is used to make decisions about my life, I can have sort of an overview of what's been going on. Now, that's obviously quite simplistic. But as Kieron just mentioned, there are, of course, a number of intricacies and things that are much more difficult to determine, right? Take, for example, generative AI, a topic that right now is huge, right? And I remember when OpenAI came up, I think it was 3 years ago, when they developed GPT-2 at that point, I believe, they came out and said, well, we have developed this algorithms that is too dangerous to be published, but didn't actually publish it. And at that point, I thought, yeah, sure, like what a nice PR stunt. But looking now at where they have come, and not only them, there's a bunch of other companies that are doing really fantastic work. It's like, well, should these tools actually be put out there, just like open source, where anyone can take a picture of me and do whatever they want, and maybe use it to create a deepfake about me, or even worse? And these are some gray areas. But on the other hand, these kinds of tools can be developed by some scientists, on the other hand, to develop to recreate the voice of people who have lost it, maybe due to illness or disease or other issues, right? So the answer is that, quite unsatisfyingly, it depends. And the key, in order to set a process that is effective and that matches our values, and that maximizes the positive impact whilst mitigating the harm, the classical sentence, is to have governance processes in place that we can inspire maybe from, I don't know, data trusts or other kinds of institutional models that are out there that assesses them, I believe at least, on a case-by-case basis, depending, of course, on the nature of the specific AI system in place. Thank you.
And who should be driving this governance system? Who's accountable for driving those initiatives? I'm talking maybe for now at the enterprise level. How does that work? Is it the data science team? Is it anyone else?
It depends.
It does, but there are guidelines.
Yeah, I mean, you could look at, for example, some compliance people that, for example, need to work in tandem together with technologists. That could be one. You could centralize this across the data science teams. Some companies and some legislations, at least for example, in Asia, for example, I'm aware that they outsource this to other teams that basically finish up the deployment and implementation. In Europe, there are guidelines. Happy for you to elaborate, but it's I think the specific role is within companies and enterprises is one that is still a little bit fractured at the moment, in part because of this discrepancy between the technical teams and the leadership, in my opinion.
I'd like to counter. I don't think accountability depends. I think everyone has some portion of accountability in this space. So if you're building tools that have consequences, that have impact, it is your responsibility in the design process to look at what those impacts might be. It's very difficult. It's very easy to say, oh, you know, I've no idea. Maybe I'm developing, but there's 4 teams before a user. And the answer is that it's responsibility of each team in that line to look at what those consequences, what that future forecasting might look like. Absolutely, we ladder up to accountability, you know, CTOs, CEOs, governance and legislators. But because we're the developers, because this is the community that are building those things and driving those things out, everybody has a portion of that responsibility, and you can't hand it over or hand it off.
But how would you implement that accountability in practice then? Because I think the point I take issue with is that it's, I think, great that we all share accountability, and I think it's kind of true, and not kind of, it is true. But I think when you have companies, especially technology companies, that are sort of where the spirit is, and I'm not agreeing with it, but the spirit is move fast and break things and kind of like go as fast as possible.
Not that.
Right? And we all probably agree, well, this is probably not the right approach. But when that's kind of like the philosophy behind it, then how can you actually does it make more sense to centralize basically the accountability and have one certain central point? For example, auditing a system before it goes out there, right? That is, in my opinion, a very fair point to make. But I struggle to see how we can make sort of the accountability across the chain, across the sort of development process work when it's probably not in line with timelines and the realities of construction of these kinds of systems. Yeah.
Sarah first, and
Sarah,
Kieron,
go, Sarah.
and Kieron after.
I think I agree with both what Tess and Walter are saying. I think we both need internal people that, I think there's actually a great role for product managers when you are working on machine learning algorithms, that you as a product manager know what the potential risks are of when you actually implement whatever you're predicting for. And then probably we'll have to go to external auditors that Walter was saying that can validate if you're, as a company, indeed doing what you're saying you do. But then I think there's a much broader question to be asked, which is more about AI ethics. Like, who sets the ethical standard? Maybe you as a company have certain ethical values that do not align with what a user wants or what the government wants. And I think that's a huge discussion, actually.
The only realistic way to solve this is everyone takes a slice of the pie. There should be some governance frameworks, you're right, that work top down. There's always engineers that operate outside of that, and we need engineers to operate outside of that. That's where that innovation comes from, right? Just don't ask an engineer to explain a model, because they'll probably build another model to explain the model that they've built, and that just doesn't work for anyone. Move fast and break things is now move fast. I wanted to change it to move fast responsibly, but that didn't fly very well at Meta for some reason. But you're right, that oversight there isn't a solution that works for everyone. It's just one of the things that I always say to engineers when I talk about necessity and proportionality, and this is how we kind of judge whether a model is safe or not, and engineers look at you sideways and say, well, what's that? The simple thing is whatever you're doing, walk down there, stop a random person on the street and explain to them, this is the data that we're using, these are the inferences that we're driving about you. How do you feel about that? If their creepy scale is a 5, you probably shouldn't be doing it. If their creepy scale is a 1 or a 2, you're probably okay.
I'm interested in that creepy scale. I'd just like to see how that works. If we take a step back then, because we talked about the companies, what's the, visible AI equates to responsible AI, maybe something like that. Legislation is finally moving. There's things that are happening. Can we just take a moment just to summarize what's happening across the different continents? Who wants to take that? Maybe Kieron, that's your area?
The US?
Sure, whichever you...
the rest of the world also exists. It's not just those two options.
Yeah. I mean, we can start sort of at multiple layers. The first one is at the moment the global partnership on AI that is doing some work sort of like transnationally, and they've started out with sort of first taking all these, I think right now it's over 100 AI ethics frameworks that start with sort of describing the main principles of how we want the world to develop like emerging technologies. And they're really doing some really interesting work in setting some guidelines that inform then other organizations, such as, for example, the OECD or UNESCO, that have been developing some kind of like tools to which governments are signing up to and adhering to. And those will trickle down eventually in informing the policies that will influence the private sector. Let's split up Europe and the US. The US has been a little bit behind on AI policy, in part, and well, I don't really know why, to be honest. It's kind of the Trump years have been a little bit quiet on that front. Because they probably had different priorities. They have now been working on developing the so-called AI Bill of Rights, which is sort of an interesting development, let's call it, in the space to sort of like yet again produce some kind of like, you know, first like really tool to set the values that we want to develop. But I would say it's by no means as comprehensive as what the European Union is doing at the moment, in the sense that it's still like, at the end of the day, it's still like a tool, sort of an initial rudimentary framework that helps them set the rules of the game. But EU, go for it, Kieron.
There's two main things happening in the EU at the moment. Well, the AI Act is going to be the big one. That's still 2 years away, if that, and it's all still up in the air because nobody has an idea about how it's going to work, because nobody in the EU really has an idea about how AI works, I think. Yeah. It's a simple answer to that. The one that's closest is the Digital Services Act. That's where we're going to see AI explainability, we're going to see bans on behavioural advertising, and there's this phrase that keeps cropping up whenever you read around the DSA, that's meaningful transparency. It's got to be fair and it's got to be transparent. But we don't really know what that means. But what we do know is that somebody somewhere in your organisation has to be able to explain to a normal human being how that model actually works. That's the world that we're going to be living in.
Do you mind if I cover off some of the other aspects? So there's fantastic work going on around the world in this space. So Brazil is a leader in AI strategy. Korea is doing some fantastic work in Japan. There's the Beijing Directive. Canada's out on its own doing some fantastic stuff. And what's really important about this is that there'll be lots of different jurisdictions. So if you're operating in multiple regions, you'll need to understand how these connect, what they mean for your products and projects. But I would like to return to what Sarah said about different ethical values. These frameworks are coming from different societies, different backgrounds, different cultures, and they encode different approaches. So it's fascinating to see what's common. So themes such as transparency do tend to be common across, and what's more unique to the different localities. So if you're deploying in a certain area, it's really worth getting into the legislation in that place to find out what's happening in the background, what the culture's directing there.
Nice. And maybe one last question before we'll open up the floor for questions. But do regulators see this through the prism of visibility or transparency? Is this something that you mentioned explainability? Is this something they're thinking about when they're drafting those legislation? Anyone?
I can go, but I have talked a lot, so.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. I wouldn't say they look at it through the perspective of visibility. I think there's a lot of buzzwords, a lot of concepts that are being thrown around at the moment. If you look at, for example, Europe has this idea that they think, well, because we cannot compete with China and the US in terms of like making the fastest, best programs, we're going to become masters of regulation. That's the reaction is says 1,000 words, but they talk a lot about trustworthiness, and within trustworthiness there is of course a topic of transparency, explainability, fairness, blah, blah, blah. as sort of one of the main components. But if we look at, for example, China or Brazil, there's very different priorities. Brazil is very much focused really on like the private sector. Let's push the private sector as much as possible, because government, we cannot necessarily rely on them because there's changing administrations that are going to undo the policies of previous ones. The United States, very much focused, again, more on the private sector. The Middle East is like kind of like a government-led strategy as well that is focused on economic diversification. It really depends. But yeah, I haven't seen AI visibility per se as sort of the central term around global legislation.
Okay,
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. So maybe before we open the floor to questions, I'm going to ask each one of you, you can choose whether, what do you think AI and AI visibility is going to become in the near future, or what would you like to happen? You can choose one or the other, prediction, or what would you like to happen? Do you want to start, Tessa?
Yeah, I didn't expect that question. I'd like to see AI that works. I think there's a lot of chat about the magic of AI and the hype of AI, and look at our magical thing and what it does. And it so rarely lives up to the hype, to the story. I'd like to see a realistic understanding of what these tools are truly capable of, an explanation of where the limitations are, and a society that is able to use them for the good. And I don't think we're there yet, so that's where I'm hoping we're going.
I think we shouldn't forget that AI does show a lot of really interesting beneficial use cases, and to some extent I agree we need to work on accuracy of these models. But we are going to live in a world in the future where AI and tracking is just going to be part of our daily lives. And I think there's a big role for governments and regulators to steer that in the right direction, if you will. But yeah, we cannot stop innovation with AI and data.
I completely agree with Tessa's and Sarah's point, like 100%. I would say there's maybe 3 areas that will define the future of AI visibility and in general policies. The first one is a technical one, so what kind of new inventions will be produced. A second one, it is a policy one, the EU AI Act in the European Union, and other policies across the whole world. And then maybe there's a social one. Because at the moment, we, as I think, like Sarah, you just said earlier, I completely agree with the point that like people say they care about privacy, but their actions maybe show something different. We just all click on accept on all cookies just so that I can go on the website that I want to visit. Maybe that's going to change. I don't know. I haven't seen that much traction on it, but perhaps I'm wrong.
Is that a dig at me as a privacy person for spending 2 hours on TikTok every day? What I would like to see over the next 5 years is a more pragmatic, common sense approach from lawmakers. They seem to have just got it in their heads that AI is bad, it's going to be the end of mankind. And I don't think that that's right. I think AI that directly makes inferences about a person is where that regulation should be focused. That's where AI can be dangerous and can have negative impacts on people. The useful side of AI that's used in robotic process automation and those type of research, those types of tasks, AI is really helpful. So less regulation on the robotic and processing side and research side, and more regulation around when it directly impacts a human.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for answering these questions. That was very interesting conversation. A round of applause for our panelists. Thank you. And maybe just before the pizzas, maybe we bring on the pizzas. Any questions? You have the microphone. Yeah, you can throw it if you want. I think it's fine.
Hey, so I'm just wondering if, say for example, within the policy, I imagine you know that there's 2 big paradigms within sort of like explainable AI. There's the black box model and white box model. So from a legislation perspective, is there a preference for white box models such as physics and formula networks, or even really basic stuff like the neural vectors in clustering, or more black box models where you then apply things like oral counterfactuals, go out to consistent like data sets, and then from there determining sort of like the biases and explain your machine learning models?
That's a great question. You've got a mic, so I don't need to tell everyone what that question was. From my perspective, this is exactly what I was talking about with regulation over the next 5 years needs to be more pragmatic, because they're just colouring everything in with the same pencil and saying you've got to explain everything in the same way. And they don't quite get that AI doesn't work in the same way. They wouldn't, I doubt they would know the difference between a white box and a black box model. But I think the important thing is look at it in the same term that we looked at privacy. Like, what harms can be derived from this model, what harms on the individual, and then look at things like the signals that are being used to train the model, the way that model works. Was the data set a true representation of the population that you're going to be serving? Those types of things are just going to tick the boxes to say, yes, we've thought about this in a kind of in a responsible way, and we're semi-sure of the output because we've done quality assurance, we've done ground truth measurement, we've done all the things that we should do to make sure that this is accurate and behaving in a way that we think it should. We can't exactly tell you what's going on in that black box thing in the middle, because that's kind of the magic, the man behind the curtain. We don't really know, but we know that the inputs are good and we know that the output is good. Tessa, I'm sure you want to add some things onto the end of that.
I'm actually happy. I thought that was very comprehensive.
Can I just ask
Yeah,
something?
of course.
I would just add on to that, that I don't think not knowing how something exactly works ever stopped us from still pursuing that. I think it just is a matter of doing more research and investing in, for instance, AI ethics research. And I think a lot of good work is already being done currently. So it's just a matter of time to see better explanations of, for instance, black box algorithms.
Where is the box? Yeah, sure, go for it. Sorry, I didn't see you.
So when it comes to taking personal accountability as a data scientist, often that comes down to the company you work for. So what would you say is a good amount of due diligence to do before you decide to work for a company in terms of their ethical standards?
That's a great question. Thank you. It's a fantastic question, because I think it can be quite opaque. There's not many companies talking about their responsible AI programs. People are a bit concerned about whether it commits them legally in an uncertain legislative environment. But I think if you're looking at a company and thinking, God, they do a lot of AI, and then you go, and there's nothing about ethics or responsibility on there, I think that's a pretty good, that's a pretty good sign. I think it also depends what kind of data science development you're doing and what they're doing, and finding the match spaces there. But I think one of the problems is that lots of companies don't have a culture of ethical AI at the moment. So you can take it with you. You can be doing the courses, the SEEK courses online, become an expert in fairness metrics, and it will drive your value in the hiring market at the moment, because we simply don't have enough people who are experts in this space.
To add on to that, I was actually in a position where I was a data scientist, and I got like a recruitment interview for a different company. And my sort of tactic was there to ask what kind of use cases they were working on, because in that particular case, they were working on online advertising and how to create models that would target personal advertisements better. And that just didn't fit with my personal values. So I think start with what your own values are. What are you comfortable with or not? And then ask for that.
Can I?
Yeah, sure.
My main piece of advice would be try and speak to the people who work there. Like, find them on LinkedIn, literally add them, say, hey, do you have time for a chat? Because I find, maybe I've spent too much time in AI ethics, but I've become a little bit cynical at times, in the sense that, there is a saying, it's not a value unless you're willing to pay what that value costs. And I see a lot of companies that have like wonderful AI ethics blueprints and like toolkits and like boxes and like all these fancy names. But then when it comes to sort of like the economic decisions, they would choose with whatever some shareholder says. So maybe I'm sounding overly pessimistic, because it's generally not the case. But I know there's a very well-known large technology company that has a famous ethics team that is known for having nobody listening to the ethics team, right? And so that's the issue I'm trying to sort of like discuss here, and without mentioning any technology firms, of course. But what I'm trying to say is that it's a reality that I think if you want to find out, I would speak to the people. Yeah.
I know.
Yes.
I'm actually going to throw it, and it says, to avoid injury, do not throw at people's heads. There we go.
Hey, hi. The question I've been dying to ask is there some sort of intergovernmental conversation between the governments, right? Not just US and Europe, regarding what's like ethical AI, or how companies should treat people, their customers, that sort of thing.
Do you want to go?
There's lots and lots of that going on. Absolutely. I mean, the OECD is one of the big forums for interacting between governments. And there's conscious effort to make sure that these pieces of legislation do interact, because otherwise you'd make yourself a hostile economic environment, and people would pull. So there's a few spaces where it's happening. There's also standards organizations, things like the IEEE are doing great work about bringing people together and developing standards that are inclusive of ethical values. Do you have anything you want to add to that one?
I think that's very comprehensive. Like the main point is, the OECD. I know with the OECD, there's a lot of countries, for example, Tunisia and Morocco, that are really trying hard to get into sort of the global partnership on AI, and sort of they're trying to adjust their policies. And that's kind of like sort of the outer belt of these initiatives. But there's also some, for example, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which has like Qatar and Bahrain, which have ethical standards that are possibly very, very different from the ones that we're promoting in Europe, right? But there's a lot. There's a Nordic Cooperation Council. There's even within the European Union, there's one within APAC. And
My question is more like, there's some sort of, because they can't all agree, because they're different cultures.
Yeah.
But is there like a basic, basic standards of conduct, basic etiquette, like saying thank you, please, and thank you?
That would be UNESCO, I think. UNESCO has I think last year they published sort of some global guidelines on that. That's correct, right? Yeah. Yes.
Throw the box.
First of all, thank you so much for this kind of discussion. I have a question for all the panelists is, what does your daily job look like, and what are the projects and initiatives you're working on that is contributing to this AI visibility and transparency?
Ooh, who wants to go?
I think Kieron should go first, and we'll just work our way down the line.
My day is not as exciting as it used to be at Meta. The only client that I can talk about publicly and the work they're doing is Checkstep, who are an AI content moderation platform that we're now repositioning to be a DSA compliance platform. So one of the things we had to do to get ready for that was dig deep into the AI models that make predictions about content and videos, etc. So that's the bulk of my work right now, is getting under the hood of those AI models and making sure what we're building is aligned to the DSA. So I've spent the last 2 weeks going through the DSA article by article and trying to pull out what it means for companies. You probably have a better day than I do right now.
So my day-to-day job is I work for in research and analysis for The Economist. I would like to add at this point, I'm here in personal capacity, and my opinions do not necessarily represent the opinions of my employer. But my job is essentially split between, on the one hand, doing research and analysis and writing long reads and pieces that focus specifically on these kinds of issues that we discussed. And I would say another 50%, maybe 40% of that consists of going to events or going to policymakers and companies and presenting some evidence that is based on international best practices, with the hope and with sort of the aim of presenting evidence that might help to better policies. Yeah, thank you.
I have a mic. So I do a PhD. Most of my days are spent on thinking first of how to design a good experiment, then doing that, collecting data and analyzing it. I think where AI visibility for me was important is in a recent study where we were trying to design new interfaces to enhance email security to users. And one of the ideas that we actually had was to provide a machine learning suspicion score for all the edge cases of emails that you might get, and to explain why the suspicion score was actually like high, or at least on the edge. But actually, interestingly enough, users tend to ignore that kind of information. So again, this is the paradox that people might care, right, about explainability, but when they are doing their actual day job, they don't really seem to engage with it. So this is still an ongoing question that we're looking into, how to do that better.
And I work for Elsevier, and my opinions do not reflect those of my employer. But my day job's split across two fronts. One side is all about working with data science, engineering, and project teams to determine what governance structures should look like. So what does our AI governance look like? How do we roll it out? How do we scale it? How do we make sure it works for everyone across the business? You might have heard of Elsevier in our academic publishing capacity, but we also do a lot of work in health and medical. So we have an interesting split and teams from all around the world. So that's the governance and research side of my role. But the other side's all about training. It's about culture change. How do we make sure that everyone in Elsevier knows what AI ethics is? And we play games, we get them excited, we do workshops, because I think this isn't a technical problem. This is a socio-technical space, and we really need to bear that in mind. This isn't just a data science problem. I need everyone. We need UX, design, legal, privacy. Whoever you are, you're in on this. Throw the box.
Through the box. More questions?
So, it may very well be a question that you answer will be nothing can be done. So I guess it's more like asking for your opinion. But for countries that won't be under like EU regulation when it comes about what happens if they start using AI for like surveillance, corrupt governments, for example. Can anything be done? What's your opinion on that? Because that's a very scary prospect.
I think things can be done. I think if you're choosing to operate in an environment where you know that that's likely, so perhaps the data protection regulations aren't as developed as other jurisdictions you're working in, you can choose to hold to a gold standard. So you could say something like the EU GDPR is how you choose to operate as a company. And if you're cooperating with a governmental organization in that jurisdiction and they don't want to adhere to those standards, you can remove yourself from that space. And the more companies do that, the more will drive change towards these standards. So you can't insist, but you can choose how you operate as an organization. And returning to what Sarah said about organizational values, you really have to know that what you believe aligns with what your company believes, what your clients believe.
We're seeing that already today. So on Mastodon today, we had Thierry from the EU Commission basically calling out Twitter and saying, if you don't sort your content moderation out and you don't sort your trust and safety operation out, we're not going to allow you to operate in Europe. Trump, when he was in power, was adamant that he was going to kick TikTok out of the US. It just simply won't be allowed to happen in Europe. And we're seeing the beginnings of that already.
Yeah, perhaps the only point I have is that a lot of times these technology regulations, such as GDPR or DSA or the EU AI Act, they're quite some strong foreign policy tools. So they always go beyond the borders of just say the European Union, and both ways as well. Like if, for example, you have a country that engages and produces some mass surveillance systems, they're going to struggle to get into the European Union markets to both get the data that they need to develop their products to make it bespoke and necessary for European citizens. But simultaneously, it's going to be much more difficult for European consumers to accept them. Having said that, there can be some large countries that might be outside of, say, the European Union that might not necessarily need access to sort of other large markets just because their own market is so large. In which case, again, not mentioning examples, but I think it depends a little bit on the dependability there and the extent to which these countries or companies depend on access to certain kinds of markets, and vice versa.
Cool. Let's have 2 more questions. So then we can go and eat pizza. Who's got the box? Sorry, Pablo, I don't have the box. So you go, sorry.
Hi. Before it was mentioned about awareness of data. So it mentioned if somebody knew what was going on behind the social network, for example, they wouldn't be so cool using them. Has there been any attempt of kind of enforcing awareness and using social media? Like before you post, you need to, I don't know, answer some questions so that we know you're aware of what you're doing.
They don't work. It's like, when you're filling in the terms and conditions and it says, have you read and agreed to the terms and conditions? And we're all liars. Everybody says they've done it, nobody has. And we haven't seen real enforcement, I don't think. But the only thing that happens is if you say that you haven't read the terms and conditions, then it keeps cycling it until eventually you say it. And it's a little bit like what Sarah said earlier. Eventually you'll click the box just to get the thing. And I don't think we've seen any regulatory enforcement, although I'm sure Kieron is going to correct me.
No, we haven't seen any regulation, but I understand what you're driving at. So one of the things that's in the DSA is transparency around behavioural advertising. So click on this advert, why am I seeing this advert? The AI transparency is, why am I seeing that advert? That's a hell of a lot of computing, a hell of a lot of engineering that's got to go into that, and it doesn't take into account of buy-side platform, demand-side platform, and the way that sort of advertising on the internet works. But if you sit down and read the terms of service for Facebook, I think the read time's 10 hours or 12 hours or
30.
something? 30 hours now.
At current format.
So one of the things that transparency means to me is the right time, the right place, the right information. I look at it through the lens of trust and safety. The worst experience a user can have is have their content taken down or their account suspended because they said something that they didn't realise was violating some terms of service. What if you could detect that speech before the user clicked go and sent up a tombstone or some kind of warning box that says, this looks very similar to content that we've taken down in line with our hate speech policy before? That's much better, but that's what we need to be doing all over the place where it's important. The one pet hate, I'm going to go on a rant now as a privacy person, is embedded YouTube videos. I, as a privacy person, when I click that YouTube video, that YouTube is going to drop a cookie into my browser, regardless of what I've put in on the cookie browser choice. It should tell me that, and it doesn't. That's one of the places where we need transparency.
One word, TikTok. TikTok, and I'm not talking about European markets, I'm talking about the Chinese markets. Because we have a lot kind of like, we kind of know TikTok, and I'm a data governance expert, and as soon as I'm going to step out, I'm going to sit on the tube, I'm going to be like, yeah, let's turn this app on and watch the next video of a cute cat, right? But if you look at what China is doing, that's a real enforcement of, or let's say it's an enforcement based on the awareness that they have about the effects of the app. In China, TikTok and the amount that a child and a teenager can spend on the app is limited. I think it's 40 minutes per day. But when it comes to the enforcement of this awareness abroad, there is no such limits, right? So I would say this is kind of, in my mind, the most direct enforcement of sort of like this kind of like, what impact does this technology have and what data does it collect about me in a way that maybe in the West we're not aware yet, right? However, speaking to some American policymakers, there is some real initiatives right now to, in part because of revelations about how the data from TikTok is shipped to China, for example, to really do something about it. Whether that's actually gonna happen, I don't know. It could easily become a kind of geopolitical or geotechnological, I don't know if that's even a term, clash that is going to be sort of like played out on the back of a technology firm.
I think rather than having the company tell you, hey, just know that AI is working in the background, I think it's a matter of education, so that people from when they are young, actually we see it now with a new generation of people that use smartphones when they're in their teens, right, or even earlier. I think it's a matter of educating them what the potential risks are of when you do use digital technologies. Because, for instance, we know that from leaked papers from Facebook that young girls who look at Instagram, they keep on scrolling and see these images of perfectly shaped bodies and pretty faces. It creates an inflated or distorted image, rather, of what the real world is like or what they should be like, right? And I think it's a matter of educating both parents and children, in this case, of how to deal with these kinds of technologies, and that you instill this idea in children early on that what you might see on social media is not necessarily a representation of what's out there in the real world.
I think we should take the question from the man jumping up and down at the back over there. Hello.
That's going to be our last question, and then obviously we can. Who's got the box over there?
My first question is, I wanted to get your thoughts about the gap. Hi, hello.
That's better.
I just want to get your thoughts about the skills gap and the AI knowledge gap between people who legislate for AI and people who develop for AI. In my opinion, that's growing and that's going to continue growing, so I just wanted to get your thoughts there. And then the second quick question is, let's say you have two models. One model is explainable and follows regulation and has accuracy of 70% detecting tumors, but then these researcher labs, we get 95% accuracy. That is a completely opaque, completely black box model. Which model do you pick? Thank you.
A dilemma to finish. But there was two questions in one.
Yeah.
Who wants to take the first one?
I'll do the first one. I think the trick with narrowing the gap is to make everybody go to everything. A lot of our senior leadership team is interested in what education are we providing for the data scientists, for the technical teams? What education are we providing for legal, for policy? And I want to see all those people in one workshop, because I think it's the only way to start closing that gap is to create events that are more inclusive, that bring people together and that create that sharing of knowledge, because in this space, you're not going to be able to operate unless as a data scientist you have a reasonable understanding of the rules around the development. And I really think that getting those the business leaders on board with what the technical terms mean and what it means for them is really important. So I've got to get everybody together for that one.
Can I just add to that before I hand over to Walter for part two, because he went, when he heard that question. So part one, technology outpaces regulation and outpaces lawmakers' understanding of technology by far. But the tangible thing that everyone can do is to put this stuff into practice every day. So this AI explainability shouldn't be something that's pushed on by regulation. It should be something that we should all be able to do to counter bias, to make sure that we're behaving responsibly. And the funny thing is the more that companies find themselves doing that and the more responsible AI teams there are, the less likelihood there is to be of burdensome regulation that makes you explain how your AI works, because that trust between tech and lawmakers actually begins to increase.
I think bridging the gap between technical people and non-technical people is like so age-old. It's not just with the topic of AI, and I think that's why we need good generalists, I would say, or like governance type kind of people. We call them consultants very often, that can bridge these two gaps. So it's literally like translating, for instance, business values to how you implement that in the technology and vice versa. You want to say something?
I 100% agree. It's like whenever you go to policymakers or to businesses and you mention the T word, talent, everyone's like, oh, that's always our biggest issue. And it's like there's been so many initiatives that have been tried out. Some companies say maybe we can do a tech fellowship or exchange programs between tech firms and government to sort of like infuse these kinds of organizations with tech talent, which is a great idea, but that creates the issue of lobbyism, right? Because it's kind of like a revolving door where you have these exchanges. There's, in the UK, there's, I think, the number 10 innovation fellows, which are basically 10 of the best people in tech that get to work, or most talented people in tech that get to work within government and solve particular issues. Yeah, but it's 10 people, right? Not 1,000. So I don't know how to answer that. I completely agree with what Sarah said.
I want to add one more thing. Don't let it get gappy. If you're thinking, I'm an AI person and those policy people don't understand me, then go and tell them. Change that profile. Also, in answer to part 2, I would take the 70% one in the cancer example, because I think explainability is really important and it affects people's lives directly.
I want to say something controversial. I think I would go with the 95% one. Just because, oh God. Just because I think if it's like, I don't know, 100,000 people that you could save for that, it's still like, what, 20,000 people more that you could save? And it's not just about, I think, the specific outcome, and that I think it's the number that you can get through that is safer, but because you can set in place the necessary safeguards. You can maybe not explain directly the algorithm, because it might be a black box, but you can control the data that goes in it. You can control how the output is being used, and you can control who has access to it. So I think that the risk that it's a black box in that case, in my opinion, it's manageable.
Perfect. A split answer on a dilemma. That's typically AI. That's beautiful. To conclude our talk, thanks Kieron, thanks Walter, thanks Sarah, and thanks Tessa for participating in this fantastic conversation. Thanks all.